Thanks for that excellent video from SocGen. And SocGen are joining us on the panel this afternoon in the shape of Allan Baker, but we have two other very important guests on the panel to discuss hydrogen. And I'd like to introduce Paro Konar. Welcome remotely to this afternoon discussion. It's great to see you here. Paro is the Director of Industrial Energy at BEIS, so she is at the very heart of BEIS energy and industrial policy, including, most importantly, decarbonisation policies and low carbon and hydrogen. So we look forward to hearing from Paro shortly. Andy Lane is to my left. Andy is the Vice President of Carbon Capture, Use and Storage Solutions for BP, and he leads BP's global activity in carbon capture and storage. And he is also the Managing Director of Net Zero Teesside. So welcome, Andy. Three men in suits here, all with ties. We're in Scotland, so we got three for the price of two. I think we're wearing almost identical ties. But it's a bit strange, I think, for all of us to be back wearing suits and ties for the first time in probably about 18 months. And last but not least, I referred to him before, Allan Baker, the Head of Energy at SocGen. He has financed many energy projects in Europe, in the USA, in Asia, and he is now increasingly involved in renewable energy rather than energy in its widest sense, and in particular, hydrogen. So welcome to our panel. We're hoping to be joined as well by Michael Liebreich, the founder of New Energy Finance, which became Bloomberg New Energy Finance. He is the chairman now and the chief executive of Liebreich Associates, and is an advisor to the UK Board of Trade and a great expert on hydrogen. If he's able to dial in, we know that he will. So I'm going to open up the discussion, and I'm going to come to you first, Paro, of course. And I thought just a gentle introduction to talk about your interest in hydrogen and what you're working on in relation to hydrogen, how your role is relevant to our hydrogen future. So over to you, Paro.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me on the panel. I cover, amongst various things, the hydrogen economy for the government, and in that we're sort of looking at the whole system for hydrogen, thinking about not just the supply of hydrogen, and we can sort of come into a bit more detail around what the government is doing in this space, but also, stimulating the demand for hydrogen in not just the industrial sector, which is going to be quite key for our economy's hydrogen transition, but also the sectors such as transport, power, heating. So it's a cross economy perspective. However, demand and supply don't exist by themselves. We need to also think about, the transport and storage angle, and that's also something that we're thinking about. My interest in hydrogen and what I cover is related to the other elements of the portfolio that I look after. Industrial decarbonisation is something that I also focus on, and in that context we have to take 16% of UK's emissions and bring that down to as close to zero as possible. And for that, technologies such as hydrogen, as well as carbon capture, usage and storage, will be quite key to drive to that deep decarbonisation that we're looking for.
Thanks, Paro. I'm going to ask the same question next of Andy, because Andy's particular interest is carbon capture and storage. And there is, of course, a link there to hydrogen, but I guess you would call that blue hydrogen. Is that right, Andy? Tell us about your interest this afternoon.
Absolutely, Nicol, and thanks for that. So, yes, as you introduced me, my job's around carbon capture, use and storage, particularly in the UK anyway, focused on the East Coast cluster. So that's the area Teesside through Humberside. And in that geography, we're looking to build the carbon transport and storage infrastructure, which will allow decarbonisation of a number of different industries. and probably the one of relevance today would be hydrogen. So there are existing hydrogen producers in that area right now who produce, in the colour coding scheme, grey hydrogen, and decarbonising or being able to store the carbon from those sources will convert their hydrogen production from grey to blue, so it'll be low carbon. But there are many projects in Teesside and Humberside that are looking to establish themselves to build basically the beginnings of the hydrogen economy here in the UK, and source clean, low carbon hydrogen for many different industries in the way that Paro described at the beginning. So my interest, in a sense, is as an enabler of the hydrogen economy, particularly in the space of the blue hydrogen, rather than hydrogen itself.
And you got some good news from the government on that front recently. Tell us a little bit about that before we move to Allan.
We did. So we're delighted to say that government's chosen the East Coast cluster, which is the area I described between Teesside and Humberside, anchored on the Northern Endurance Partnership transportation and storage infrastructure, but including a total of 17 different capture projects, a number of which were hydrogen, as one of the two kind of priority track one carbon capture clusters here in the UK. And we're now working with Paro's department in some detail to map out the remaining sort of business models that are necessary to underpin that, and getting ready for the next stage of the process as government works out which of those capture projects in that geography are going to get to be supported for that first wave of development. So exciting news for us, and great the recognition for that area, which produces about 50% of the emissions from industrial clusters in the UK. So it's the biggest single area of emissions. So a reasonably natural place perhaps to start the journey towards decarbonising existing industries and future industries as well.
Thanks very much indeed. And the government funding is obviously of crucial importance to all of that, but there is room, I guess, for the private sector. I also guess that the government would not be doing this without some promise of private sector funding or commitment from the private sector on its way. So that is a cue for SocGen and Allan Baker, I think. So Allan, tell us about your interest in hydrogen.
Yeah, so I think we've been following hydrogen for some time. There have been several false dawns in terms of the implementation, but we think this time hydrogen is absolutely essential to decarbonisation. And we agree with the government there and IEA, various other institutions. I think we'd like to be at the forefront of financing the hydrogen industry, as we are hopefully at the forefront of CCS and have been for offshore wind and other clean energy over the past few years. I guess the sort of frustration for us is that we haven't yet seen the projects coming through the system that are ready for financing. But we've certainly had a role in trying to help governments, help projects to develop what will be bankable structures, so that when they're ready for financing, we should hopefully be able to mobilise capital in their direction. And there's no shortage of capital. I mean, if you just look around the trade magazines, you go to conferences, banks are very, very interested in the sector and standing ready to mobilise significant amounts of money to finance the sector once the business models are in place and the projects are ready to push the button.
Thanks, Allan. Well, I'm going to divide this into sections. We've got some key themes. They will be pretty familiar to most of you, so let's try and do it in a way that's a bit more interesting and provocative. So let me start with Andy on this one and say, is hydrogen simply an overhyped pipe dream?
No, it's a great question, and there's certainly a lot of hype. I do agree with that. I mean, I think our view in BP would be that hydrogen will represent a share of the energy industry that's equivalent to what natural gas share today, so 20%, pick a number, by 2050. So while there is meaningful hydrogen production today around the globe, it's by and large going into industrial processes, it's going into refineries and this kind of thing, and it's not necessarily visible or part of the wider energy scene, and it's not familiar to most people. But we believe hydrogen will play a really important role in the journey towards net zero. It complements other technologies. It's an and, not an or, when you talk about, say, renewable power or other elements of CCUS. So we genuinely believe that hydrogen will make a very significant impact in the journey to net zero, and will probably be of an equivalent size to the size of the current natural gas business in the world. So, absolutely huge.
So we'll have a network, will we? Pipelines coming to our houses, our homes. Is that the vision of the future that you see?
So I think you hit on a really interesting one there about homes, and maybe I'll come back to that. I think probably the primary, or certainly the initial markets for hydrogen are probably the existing hydrogen consumers. So the existing heavy industries, the existing refineries, these kind of things that are currently consuming hydrogen today, but relatively high carbon hydrogen. So I think a natural place to start would be, let's clean that up first. Let's move those existing customers over to lower carbon. And then I think there's a sort of a natural set of industries and markets that favour hydrogen. So you have heavy industry to start off with. You have some industries that use natural gas for heat that could replace with hydrogen relatively easily. You've got, for instance, heavy vehicle mobility, and I'm talking trucks, buses, trains here, not yours and my car on our front drive, I think, personal view. That eventually, I think, power, using hydrogen as a generator of flexible power. And then I think at the end of that spectrum, there was a very live discussion as to whether hydrogen blended into our gas grids and showing up in your boiler and my boiler at home is part of the journey to the future. And obviously government are thinking about that. There are alternatives in the form of heat pumps, and there are arguments pro and con, I think, between the kind of heat pumps argument and the hydrogen boilers argument. But regardless, I think, of your position on domestic heating, there are many other things that hydrogen will naturally become a fuel for over time, growing from where we are today.
What do you think, Paro? Is it a pipe dream, or will it be coming to us through pipes?
So hydrogen's not a silver bullet, right? I mean, you can't do everything using hydrogen. I think it is one of a handful of new low-carbon solutions, which is going to be crucial for deep decarbonisation of the UK economy. Both Andy as well as Allan talked about, some of the sectors which are currently using hydrogen. They're using high carbon hydrogen. So industrial processes, particularly in hard to electrify industrial sectors, which use high temperature processes, you will need a gaseous form of low carbon technology to drive decarbonisation there, right? So there are places where we can see hydrogen being used immediately. And we're sort of going to try and drive demand there. Over time, hydrogen will play a bigger and bigger role in any low carbon future. A lot of modelling, not just by the government in the net zero strategy, the CCC, which is the Committee of Climate Change, also sort of talked about this, is that hydrogen is going to be critical for meeting the UK's legally binding net zero targets for 2050, and also for our sixth carbon budget target of 78% reduction from 1990 levels by 2035. So I don't think it's a pipe dream. I think it's indeed a reality.
Thanks, Paro. And Michael has now joined us. I'm delighted to see you, Michael. I don't know if you've heard the question, so I'll repeat it just in case. But we did introduce you at the start of the session, and we're very pleased that you've been able to join the panel this afternoon. Is it hydrogen an overhyped pipe dream, or is it going to be everything that people are saying today that it might be? Michael, we're not hearing you here. I don't know if you can hear me, but we're not picking up your audio.
Let me try that. How's that doing?
That's good.
Excellent. Good news. Thank you.
That was a pandemic moment there where I didn't unmute. Sorry about that, everybody. Look, it's great to be here with such a esteemed company. I'm afraid the question as you phrase it was, is it a pipe dream, or is it everything that people say? And the answer is it's going to be something in between, because there are use cases. We are currently using fossil-based hydrogen. It's a $160 billion industry. And by the way, 95% of that hydrogen that's being used in fertilizers and in refineries is actually made local to where it's used. There are very few hydrogen pipelines currently, partly because it's just such a big volumetric molecule. I mean, it's very, although it's energy dense on the weight basis, volumetrically, it's very non-dense. So it's a very difficult thing to move around. So we'll be using clean hydrogen to decarbonize those hydrogen uses, because if not, that's 2% of global emissions that we can't decarbonize. And there's some other use cases that make a lot of sense. So it's most likely to be used in steel. It's most likely to be used in some form in shipping, maybe in the form of ammonia as a fuel. But when you get to some of the things where we already have fantastic solutions, people talk about, there are people designing hydrogen scooters, hydrogen delivery vans, hydrogen cars, I'm afraid, hydrogen buses. All of this stuff is just better solved with a simpler, more efficient, lower maintenance solution. And so it's just fanciful to think that hydrogen is going to go into those use cases. And at the moment, we're at the kind of period of maximum hype and maximum excitement. So we have announcements like, oh, we're going to be importing hydrogen made in Australia. We're going to import into the UK to use in transportation use cases. We're not going to be doing any of that stuff. That's just not a thing. So it's somewhere in between the essential and the completely ludicrous, and all of it is being promoted with equal fervor and relish, and money being spent by some of the large corporations.
Thanks, Michael. Allan, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that really sums up the problem for the finance community at the moment. We see a plethora of projects, and you could call them PowerPoint projects because they're very well presented. They look very credible on paper, but when you really dig into the fundamentals, they make more or less sense. So I think one of our challenges is really to try to sort out the projects which are the right projects to start the industry, get the industry off the ground. And I do agree as well that there's a lot of benefit in choosing projects or working on projects which are located close to the consumer to start with, to get the market going, because that's the simplest solution. So as you say, the steel industry, we're seeing now some green steel projects emerging using hydrogen generated from hydro or from other renewables virtually on site. So very co-located, which I think is a good thing. And I think going back to Paro's comments around the UK and the way the UK is approaching it, the business models are designed really to do that, to encourage the beginning of the industry to solve the cost gap and bring supply and demand along together, so you develop the base market before you then move into the very large export markets that are potentially there in the future. Not forgetting that hydrogen is very difficult to ship, so we see a lot of projects talking about shipping hydrogen. They're not really going to ship hydrogen, they're going to ship ammonia, green ammonia, so there's an additional cost, an additional step to convert from green hydrogen to green ammonia for that shipping. So I think it's a question of small steps to develop the industry before you get to what we hope is and expect to be a commoditized industry down the road.
And how long is that going to take to happen?
That's a very good question. I wish I knew the answer to that question.
I'm going to come to the others on this question as well. Timing, when is this change going to happen? Because timing is so important, and the pressure on everyone at COP26 is to make things happen sooner and to make things happen in a really significant way. So can we make hydrogen happen quickly?
I think we're seeing those projects starting to come through now on a smaller scale, on a local scale, as well as the grand plans that we see of major export projects. So we're working at the moment on a green steel project that's moving towards a point where we can raise financing for that. Makes a lot of sense. Economically, we're seeing some other projects like that now starting to come through. But you need to take those small steps to then get into the period when the market really accelerates.
Yeah.
It's
Michael,
a bit like offshore wind, sorry.
Sorry, Michael, I was just going to say, you finish your point, Allan, and I'll come to Michael on this one.
It's similar to what we saw in offshore wind. We saw a very slow pickup to start with. It was very high cost. When you start to get to scale, when technology developed, costs come down, you see that acceleration. And I think we'll see the same in hydrogen. Whether that's in 5 years or 10 years, difficult to say. A lot of it depends on policy, so I'm going back to Paro.
Well, we'll come to that issue, but you're right. Offshore wind was £150 per megawatt hour, and it's now down at just under £40 per megawatt hour. So a real transformation there in costs. Michael, will the same things happen with hydrogen? Where will it happen first, and how quickly will it happen, in your view?
He's frozen.
Michael? Okay, we've lost Michael, so Paro, maybe we could come to you. Can you hear us on that same issue?
Both frozen.
Both gone.
I guess
this is a presenter's delight. Well, not because we're struggling, but because we'd like to hear from you. Over to Andy.
So yeah, I mean, how do you follow that? So I agree with Allan there, and maybe there's an analogy here. Most of my career I've worked in natural gas, and I would describe the natural gas industry as something that probably started in the 60s, and it's got to where it's got to today, 20% energy penetration in 60 years. If we're to replace that with hydrogen and do it twice as fast, it'll still take 30 years. So the scale of the ambition here is utterly staggering, and that's what net zero requires in many different sectors, not just the gas sector. I think it's the same in vehicles, it's the same in many other areas, but we layer on top of each other multiple challenges of that kind of magnitude. You've got to recognise what we're trying to do globally with the global energy system. It is really, really profound. However, you've got to start, and you've got to start, and then you've got to scale. You've got to start, learn, scale, and keep going. So I think getting going to start off with, these first-of-a-kind projects involve different risk propositions for the equity holders and the debt holders. They probably require some difference in regulatory footprint than will eventually be applied. I think you could evolve regulations from the initial version through to something when you've got a sophisticated fungible market, which obviously we're not yet. There'll be technology developments along the way that cut costs and that open up sectors of market. There'll be a growth in demand for clean products, and I'm a strong advocate of growing the markets as well as growing the supply at the same time. And I mean, that's not rocket science, but I think a lot of the time we talk about regulation on the supply side. Actually, there's just as much value on the mandate side on the customers as well, and maybe we should have a separate conversation about that. So, I would say it will be remarkable if we achieve the potential of hydrogen fully in 30 years, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't start. And you have to start at speed now and get it moving on the first of a kind, and recognise some of the risks with that, and invest, scale up, reduce costs, and get into a virtuous circle there of increasing scale and decreasing cost, which makes hydrogen cost competitive against other alternative fuels. And it's exactly the wind analogy as Allan makes.
Thanks, Andy. Let's come to the whole issue of colour in hydrogen. And we have grey, we have blue, and we have green. And I think nobody is promoting grey here at COP26, so we can kind of rule that one out straight away. But I guess grey is still a pretty big market in the current commercial market. But we have then the battle between blue and green. What are your thoughts, Allan, on that issue and the pricing around it, but also the focus of investment? If we're going to go seriously for renewable hydrogen, for green hydrogen, does that mean we have to move away from blue hydrogen, or is blue hydrogen still an important stepping stone, making use of Andy's carbon capture facilities, a stepping stone to the future?
I think it is very much a stepping stone. The grade of hydrogen you'll produce, or how you produce it, really depends on where you are in the world as well, and the resources that you've got. Clearly if you're sitting in Australia, or you're sitting in the Middle East, or you're sitting in Chile, for example, you've got huge renewable energy resources at relatively low cost. So you have a competitive advantage in producing green hydrogen, again at relatively low cost. And I say relatively because there still is a cost gap even for green hydrogen at the moment. So that's the production side of it. You've still got to get the hydrogen to the market. So if you're not fortunate enough to be in, having steelworks in the Middle East, for example, you're not able to access that green hydrogen as easily as you need to be able to really start converting industry. You need to convert to ammonia and then be able to use ammonia or reconvert. So blue hydrogen in some areas where we have got the resource to store the CO2, where you haven't got as much access to renewables or cheap renewables, makes sense if you want to convert your industry locally and start that decarbonisation process. So I think we see, in some areas blue hydrogen as being the answer, at least to start with. maybe when costs come down, you can replace that with green. And in other areas, green hydrogen seems to be the place to start. I would say you've missed out pink hydrogen, turquoise hydrogen.
Yeah.
There are a plethora, again, of colours. There are almost as many colours as there are hydrogen projects. I know Andy's got a view on that, but we're really looking at, given that we're looking at the local market to start with, we're looking at the best solution for that market, the most cost-effective solution for that market to get it off the ground, to get the industry off the ground.
We'll come to Andy and BP's view on this in just a moment, but I want to bring Michael back in here. Michael, great to see you again. And we're talking about colours, and I know you have strong views on this, grey, blue and green, and I think your views have evolved over time. Tell us about your current thinking on this issue.
Yeah, my views have evolved. I mean, green is obviously sort of super virtuous and marvellous. I have great reservations about blue on two fronts. One is, of course, fugitive methane emission. So the loss of methane. Methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas. Even a couple of percent of losses, and you've got so much warming, you might as well not bother, just go with gas. The same around the CO2 capture. If you do blue hydrogen, so you're using a natural gas feedstock, removing the CO2. But if you only remove 80%, let's say, and the 20% goes up the chimney while you're making the hydrogen, don't bother. Then that's just not going to work. So I have these great reservations. Those reservations can be addressed, right? I also have huge faith in engineers and not so much faith in regulators. So I think that if civic society puts pressure on regulators, if the incentives are clearly there for engineers to do their job, there is nothing in the laws of physics or engineering or even, frankly, finance that says that we can't have blue hydrogen with low losses of methane in the fractions, tiny fractions of a percent, approaching zero, and capture of CO2 in the very high percentages, even approaching 100%. Nothing to say we can't do that. We do have to do that. It might make the economics a bit worse, and so it affects the competitiveness, but it can certainly be done. And anybody, by the way, there was this paper by Professor Jacobson and Howarth, got lots of press coverage by saying blue hydrogen was just sort of inherently as bad as coal and gas. That is, I'm afraid, just nonsense. It can be done well. And the volume of hydrogen that we're going to need, even in a world where we only do the existing uses, where we're currently using grey hydrogen, that $160 billion market of grey hydrogen, polluting hydrogen, if you wanted to replace that right now with green hydrogen, hydrogen from renewable energy, that would use every single solar panel and every single wind turbine that has been built to date. So we're trying to use another color, we're trying to redline the growth of renewable electricity. We're trying to go as fast as possible, right? And now you want to add, if you're a fundamentalist, you only go for green hydrogen, you're adding demand that is equivalent to all the renewable energy that has been built to date. And then if you get into steel and you get into ammonia for shipping, and you get into maybe some synthetic fuels for aviation, maybe some long-term storage, all these fantastic use cases where we probably do need hydrogen. You start trying to do all of that with green hydrogen, we will be decades trying to catch up and meet the demand for hydrogen using only green hydrogen. And we don't have decades. So I've made my peace with blue hydrogen as long as it's done right.
Thanks. Andy, the case for carbon capture, what happens to that if we move away from blue hydrogen and go to green?
So maybe just to touch on the previous question, I completely agree with Michael's analysis there. I think blue hydrogen has the moral obligation to be done right.
Yeah.
And done right, it's a low carbon
and a lot
hydrogen.
Of great information there.
And I completely agree. I mean, just by way of example, BP's methane emissions are less than 0.02%.
Yeah.
So running around people quoting multiple percents is just not where we live. in the world where you're creating large amounts of hydrogen, these are new build facilities. You're charging your engineers with building high quality facilities with the highest possible capture rates associated with them, so that you can produce the lowest carbon hydrogen possible. And I think we're, as BP, colourblind, as I've said before, about our approach to blue and green.
So grey is...
Grey's out, okay.
Yeah.
Colourblind with the exception of grey.
Yeah.
Thank you for the correction there.
Is grey a colour?
Yeah, or lack of.
Okay.
And I think there are places where the technology, where one has a favour over others, and it's renewable resources, the ability to store. But coming back to your question on CCUS, CCUS think of it as a tool, really. It's a tool to decarbonise multiple different industries, hydrogen being one of them. But I think
hydrogen's very important to your particular project, though.
It is. So, but maybe actually that's a good analogy. If I go around the projects that I'm involved in the East Coast cluster in the UK, so we've got existing industries. We've got existing industries producing fertilisers and chemicals and hydrogen today. In a world with carbon pricing and in a world where we need to get to net zero, we need to do something with those industries that exist today. Not only that, they give jobs to high quality jobs to local people in parts of the country that desperately need them. So there's a kind of moral just transition imperative there that we do something with our existing industry. So that's one to start off with. We've talked about hydrogen, but if we just talk to the other couple of areas where carbon capture really brings benefits that in many cases can't be matched in any other way, one would be power. I noticed at the panel before this, there was a very animated conversation about the need for flexible low carbon power in our power grid to be able to balance renewable energy on the famous day the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, of which we've had quite a few. And decarbonising gas with CCUS to generate flexible power is a really important component of getting the whole power mix down to zero by 2035, as it's now targeted. And the final point I wanted to make would be about greenhouse gas reductions. So the net in net zero is really important. There are some industries which it will be nigh on impossible to reduce the carbon emissions from. So we need some negative to net out the nation at net zero. So greenhouse gas reductions as a group of technologies, in a nutshell, storing carbon that was in the air one way or another in the ground, either direct air capture or from sort of bioenergy. So you need somewhere to store that carbon, and that's CCUS again. So I'm supremely relaxed if every hydrogen molecule in the world was green, which I don't believe is viable or the most cost-effective or practical way of doing it. There would still be lots of value and need for the technology of CCUS. Think of it as a tool for multiple forms of decarbonisation.
Thank you, Andy. The final area I'd like to come to is about global policies on this and global financing. And let's focus in on the financing, Allan. Let's come to you. Mark Carney's pulled together this $130 trillion fund. Will some of that get to hydrogen, and will some of that come from SocGen?
I think yes and yes, but there's a time scale to this. As I said, the banks, including SocGen, are already mobilising huge amounts of money towards clean energy, and we're really focused on delivering net zero alongside our clients. I think, as I said before, the hydrogen dilemma for us is really finding the bankable projects, the first projects to start that process. But there is no doubt in my mind that there's a huge amount of liquidity available for those projects. We've seen it in other areas of clean energy technology. We see the enthusiasm within the finance community for hydrogen. I mean, if you go to any conference that's discussing hydrogen, the financiers are there, they're looking for the projects, they want to finance the industry, they can understand the industry. It's very analogous to what many of the banks are doing on the gas side of their business, as we said before. So, there is that almost pent up, demand for opportunities to deploy that capital. So, if we find good projects, the money's there.
Thanks, Allan. Paro, you're back with us after our technical problems. So this question to you. Now, I'll make this very easy for you. Let's look at policies internationally. Let's look at the United States. Let's look at Europe and the United Kingdom. Let's look at Asia Pacific. Which countries are getting it best? Which are the ones that are getting it right? And what are the comparisons you'd make?
So, for us from the UK government, we'd like to work with all countries and learn from them and use whatever models that they're developing to make sure that we are continuing to develop the best models to allow for a credible investment pathway in the UK's hydrogen economy. However, I'm responsible for the UK's hydrogen sector, so I'll talk about what we're doing in the UK. For us, one of the first things that we wanted to focus on was investor certainty, right? There is no way that through only government financing, you're going to be able to expand to the scale that is needed for a hydrogen economy to develop. So as part of doing that, we published the hydrogen strategy, which gives you a sense of a roadmap from where we are now to where we need to get to allow the UK's hydrogen economy to develop. We have announced an ambition of 5 gigawatts of hydrogen production capacity by 2030, and we have provided funding, which we look to co-fund with our industry partners, such as colleagues in the CCUS clusters, as well as Allan from the debt side. So, but to do that, the UK has to put out what sort of certainty, regulatory certainty, it is providing. In which we're putting out business models. So basically, these are long-term financial models, which will be providing long-term subsidy to the sector. We also have a fund, which we have announced to develop low-carbon hydrogen production in the UK. And that fund is worth £240 million, which goes from now until 2025. We've got a £1 billion program, which is all about sort of developing CCUS clusters in the UK. So there's a lot of government funding backing it. There's a lot of regulatory certainty, which we have tried to put in place, sort of financial models, as well as the funding behind those financial models. And this is not the first time that the government is doing this, right, to develop a new sector. We've done this before for offshore wind, and there are lessons that we can learn. And the plan is to sort of have a transition similar in scale for the hydrogen perspective. I just wanted to pick on the green-blue debate that you were having earlier.
We're out of time, so I was hoping to bring Nicol in. So this will be the last comment, and then I'm afraid we'll have to close it there.
Sure. The reason that I wanted to come in is because we get very fixated with colours. It's not about colours. It's about low-carbon hydrogen, right? I mean, that's what we need to have in the UK. And for that, we have introduced something known as a low-carbon hydrogen standard, which we have consulted on, which makes sure that the hydrogen that is produced is the most low carbon possible, and both green as well as blue should be part of the picture for that.
Paro, thank you very much. That's a very strong point to close on, and Nicol, Allan and Andy were all nodding in agreement, so that's achieved some sort of consensus on this panel at least, but a very important topic for the future. I'm sorry that we didn't have more time, but thank you all for your contributions this afternoon, being part of COP26. Very exciting for all of us.